Painting scales is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. Now you can totally watch only this one specific video if all you care about is how to paint scales, but I do want to mention that it is part of a complete digital art course designed as a month-long, 100% free YouTube series. So if you want to take on the challenge of improving your art skills, make sure to check out the course details on my website, and make sure to subscribe as well as ring the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming lessons. So if you're painting your scales in the illustration you already have, obviously that's where you would paint them. Otherwise, if you're just practicing along with the course, go ahead and create a new canvas that is big enough so you can zoom in without seeing a bunch of pixels, but not too big that it just takes a lot of space on your iPad or whatever other device you're using. So for reference, these are the dimensions that I will be using. It's literally just the size of the iPad screen, so nothing crazy here. Now, one question I often get is, how do I have the little reference image in the top corner of my iPad? If you're using Procreate, you just go in the wrench icon menu. In the canvas option, you're going to have the reference little toggle, and you can activate that. It's going to let you import an image, and so you could just import an image and then you would have it as a reference. One more thing you might want to do if you're just practicing is to set your background to a neutral gray. Now that's going to allow you to see the contrast in your texture a bit better than if you were painting on white, for example, because that kind of distorts your perception a little bit. So we're going to start by just creating a silhouette of the base shape we want. So just a new layer for that. And here you can use really any colors you want for your scales, but if you want to follow along with exactly the same colors I am using, I will link my color palette in the description below, along with the reference image, by the way. So for that, just pick the base color you want your scales to be, so just the general color, and set your brush to the most simple brush you can find. So in Procreate, the hard brush in the airbrushing panel would be perfect for that. And on a new layer that you can rename to base, you're going to draw the silhouette of your shape. Here, since I'm practicing on a sphere, I'm just going to draw a circle, but if you were to draw a fish, a lizard, or something like that, you would have, the fish or lizard silhouette. So once you have your base silhouette, go ahead and create a new layer right above it, rename it to guides, and just pick any color of your choice here, because we're not going to see those guides in the final result. We're going to delete it in just a few seconds, but we need to make sure that we see them. And for that, you can use really any brush. I like to use a kind of pencil brush that is a bit thinner than just a hairbrush. So I'm gonna go and Procreate with the 6B pencil, but seriously, we're not seeing these guides here. We just want to map out something, so use any brush you like. And what we're going to do is we're going to map out the different rows of scales. So what you want to do is making sure that they follow the curvature of whatever object you're painting on. So if it was a fish, your fish is not fully flat. So making sure that your rows, the horizontal lines that you're roughly sketching right now, they don't need to be perfect, but make sure that they follow the form. So in the case of a sphere, they would be slightly curved horizontal lines. So you can see it really doesn't need to be perfect, but you just want to have a really rough base guide here. And once you have that, again, it should not take super long, go ahead and create a new layer above that guides layer and rename it to shadows. So just like we did for the feathers, we are going to roughly map out the different scales and later use that same layer to start as a base of the shadow. So it's kind of a 2-in-1, it's really a hack, so it doesn't take too long. And you can go with a darker version of your base color, but you can also, you can do that and also apply your layer as the blending mode multiply. So multiply, what it does is basically now this layer is just going to look darker on other colors. I'm not going to go into too much details about that, but it's a great blending mode to use for shadow. And there are so many different shapes you can use for scales. You can have something super pointy, you can have something really round, you can have an in-between. So here, really explore and make sure to look at reference pictures if you're drawing a real animal to look what the scales on that animal look like. Here I'm gonna go with really round, kind of flat scales, but again, it's the same base technique, just you would change the shape and change a few things, but I'm going to cue you on those things later in the process. So for now, just find a shape that you want to work with and just fill in the different rows of scales. And there's another thing to keep in mind here that's going to depend on the animal you're painting, and that's the way the different scales overlap. So there's not just the shape of the scale, there's also, are they overlapping each other? Are they laying down next to each other? If they're overlapping, what is the kind of pattern that they're doing? So here I'm gonna go with something super basic. Honestly, it's not realistic at all, but make sure that if you're drawing, again, a real animal, you look at that overlapping pattern. Some fish have really tight little round scales like this. Some lizards have super pointy, far away from each other scales. So look at nature and explore and experiment. You get a bunch of different varieties of scale and patterns that way, and it's super fun. But again, it's the same technique, so just map them out. Don't take too long. You really just want to roughly sketch everything, and we're going to use that later to create the shadows anyway, so it really doesn't need to be, you know, the cleanest little sketch lines at this point. Just map them out, and that's more than enough for now. It takes long enough to draw scales. You don't need to agonize over this step. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please let me know which animal you're painting the scales on, if you're painting on animal, or if you're just practicing on the sphere, just write sphere. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be like, what's the deal with the secret password? It's kind of a game we're playing here. In every single video, I had a secret password at one point, and it's for you to find. And that does a few things. One of them is it gives me a lot of information on how to edit and paste my videos better, which helps me to create better tutorials for you guys. So that's already a win-win. But it's also really cool because you guys know me, you see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you guys are. And whenever you leave a comment, whatever that comment is, I get to sometimes see your face, sometimes your name, and it's just really cool to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on this channel. So just leave a comment with what you're painting your scales on, basically, and then we're going to keep going. We're going to start using the sketch as the base for our shading. Well, it's not really the shading because we're just adding the shadows between the scales. Later we're going to shade the entire thing, but yeah. Awesome, so at this stage, once you have everything roughly mapped out, all your scales row, you can go ahead and delete the guise layer. We don't need it anymore. And then simply go back on your base layer to fill in any kind of holes that you might have. So when you're drawing scales, they're going to poke out on the outside of your silhouette. So you just need to make sure that, you know, your silhouette is adapted to that. So just going over with your base color on the base layer to fill in the gaps. And you can also use the eraser to erase any previous part of the sphere or silhouette that you had that should not be there either. So super simple step, but make sure to do it. Great, so honestly by now that was probably the hardest part of the video, so if you've made it this far, you got this, you can definitely finish it up. So for now what we're going to do is apply the shadow layer as a clipping mask if that's available to you in your software, and what that does is all we paint on the shadow layer is going to stay within the base silhouette. If you don't have a clipping mask, don't worry, you can just use the eraser tool later to go back and erase what goes out. There's no need to do it right now because we're going to add more shadows and blend, and it's going to, you know, go out of line again, so don't worry about the cleanup just yet. And at this stage, we're going to add some shadows in this area here of the scales. It's really hard to explain in words. Make sure to look at the video and you're going to understand instantly. So you just go over and quickly sketch some shadows. Now at this stage, as you can see, I'm using still the little brush, the pencil brush that is quite precise and have some grit, but we're going to blend everything in later. So the brush really doesn't matter that much at this point. You just want to make sure that it's precise enough so you can, you know, draw within the lines, but the texture of the brush doesn't matter. So you could use just a regular hard brush that is very small and that would work 100% fine. So I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on the little shading between your scales. I'm going to speed up the video though, but I'm going to keep it in the background so you can use it as a reference, and we're going to meet in the next step. We're going to keep building that scale texture. Now you really don't need to go overboard with painting your shadows. As you can see here, pretty rough sketch, so that's enough. And at this stage, you can go back and use the eraser tool to erase any part of the sketch that shouldn't be there anymore. So you want to make sure that everything that you see now on the shadow layer makes some sort of sense, although it's still very rough. You can also go back and play with the opacity of that layer until you get the intensity of shadow that you like. But it's kind of hard to judge right now because we don't have a whole lot going on, so we're going to go back to it later anyway and adjust the opacity again. So for now, we're going to start building the lights, and I know it looks bad right now, but that's okay. Bear with me, trust the process. So just create a new layer above the shadow layer, renaming it to lights, and this one as well, if you have clipping mask available to you, you would apply it as a clipping mask. And here we're not painting like the global lights or shadows. Again, it's just going to be the lights on the individual little scales to show that there's volume going on. Now you could use so many different blending modes here. I'm going to go with lighter color for now, and you can just use a slightly different color than your base color. So just something that if you go on the color wheel, on the color strip, I guess, is just a little bit on the side, so an analogous color. And just painting on one side of the scale. Here you could go with any brush of your choice. You could stick with a precise gritty brush like a pencil brush and you would get a bit more of a sketched look. Or you could go with a softer brush like an airbrush brush. In Procreate you could use, for example, the medium brush. Now here, it doesn't really matter much because we're going to use this smudge tool later to blend the lights and the shadows, so the brush you use to place them down doesn't really affect the final result that much. I like using a soft brush here because it's just a bit quicker, I find, than having a very thin, precise brush. Now here, you're just going to place the lights on one side of each scale, and that side is going to be the side where your light source is, obviously. So here I'm pretending my light source is on the top left. And depending on the type of scale you're painting, you might have a super soft gradient in your light, or it might be clearly defined, like one side is light and the other side is dark, like with a line that runs through the middle, like a tent little kind of shape. Here I'm gonna go with scales that are kind of more of a domed, dome or flat, honestly. So my lights are going to be soft and they're going to blend throughout the entire scale, as opposed to a vertical distinction like that, so that the tent little effect I was talking about. There was probably a better name, but you know, that's what we're gonna go with. So now you really don't need to be super precise. Again, we're going to blend everything later, so just roughly place your lights. And once more, I'm going to stop talking to let you focus. We're going to meet in just a few seconds for the next step. And honestly guys, at this stage you might want to put this light layer under the shadow layer. That's a personal preference and that depends on the kind of, the kind of scale you're painting, but you could really experiment with that. You can also experiment with different blending modes and seeing if there's something you like better. You can experiment with the opacity. But don't spend too much time on that just yet because we're going to keep adding layers, and at the very end we're going to change the blending mode or play with the blending modes of all of them and seeing how they interact with each other. So for now, you can use your smudge tool, which is usually a little finger icon, and set the brush to a brush that has some texture to it if that's available to you. In Procreate, it could be the stucco brush from the painting panel. Otherwise, try to find something that maybe have charcoal or pencil in the name, and that should be good. And if that's not available to you, just use a regular, soft brush. That's okay as well. And all you can do here, super simple, is just go over your lights, so still on the light layer, and blend them in as much or as little as you want. So here, once more, you have the opportunity to customize your scale. I'm going for something very soft, but you can have, once more, a very clear definition between the light and the no light section. One thing I do want to say here, though, is when you're painting, and we're going to talk about that later in the video at the end where I give you the tips, but I just want to mention it real quick because painting scales, it's really rare you're going to just focus on painting scales and that's going to be it. Usually scales are going to be part of a bigger illustration. I mean, when do you draw a sphere, which is a bunch of scales? Never, unless you're practicing scales. So here I do want to just tell you, be careful. If you're painting scales in something else than just a sphere, don't agonize over the details of your scale. Don't make your scales too detailed because your piece is going to be really overwhelming real quick. So just kind of give the impression of scale without agonizing over making them look perfect and, adding a ton of details within them. So once you've blended your lights, you've probably seen you can go and do the same on your shadows. So just selecting the shadow layer and sticking with the same smudge tool. And this time you might want to blend your shadows as opposed to just kind of everywhere, just dragging them towards the bottom part of the scale. So that way you're adding a bit of texture in your scale if you're using a textured smudge tool, as well as just blending them so it doesn't look as crazy as it did before. And yes, this stage is a bit time consuming, but that's okay. It's pretty chill, it's not complicated, so you totally got this. And once more, I'm going to stop talking to let you focus, and we're going to meet in the next step. We're going to add some highlights, some global lights, some global shadows, and just make this piece look so much less bland than it does right now. One really cool thing about scales, I was going to say snakes, I guess snakes as well, is that the scales themselves are kind of iridescent. So depending on the light they're in, they might slightly change color, and we're going to recreate that effect really quickly by just creating a layer for now above the base, applying it as a clipping mask once more if it's available to you, and renaming it this one to color variation. Now here you can set it to really any blending mode for now because we're going to change it later. I'm going to go with color dodge, and you're just going to pick different colors. So make sure they're quite vibrant and quite saturated, and make sure they stick roughly kind of in the same direction of the color wheel or the color strip. So here, since I'm going with colder colors, like my scales are blue, I'm going to stick with colder as I'm, painting with a yellow, but it's a kind of cold yellow, so I guess it works. But basically, you just want to add random little blobs of different colors. Now here I'm using color dodge, so they look super light, but once more, you're just painting with a bunch of random colors. I would say at least 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 if you're feeling crazy. And you're going to paint those with a super soft brush. So something like a feathered round brush, like the soft brush from Procreate in the airbrushing panel, or anything else that you have that resembles that. So just something super basic and soft. And you're going to paint those focusing on the area where your light source is. So it's going to do kind of this dual function of adding some color variation, but also kind of throwing the lights. Once you have that, you can go ahead and play with the opacity of the layer and also play with the positioning of the layer. So is it going to be above the lights, below the lights, above the shadows, below the shadows? You can play with different blending modes until you find something you like. And the goal here is really to have something quite crazy. So I'm actually going to go with linear light, sorry. I think it looks really cool. We're going to add some lights later, so for now it just looks a bit weird and flat still, but I think in terms of color variation, that is exactly what we're looking for, so that's what I'm going to go with. But there's really no right or wrong way to do it, so just explore until you find something that you like. And at this point, if you want, you could go ahead and merge all of those base layers together. If you have, not a whole lot of layers available in Procreate, at least, I personally like to keep mine separate for as long as I can, so I'm just gonna keep them separate. And then you can create a new layer above everything, rename it to Global Shadows. And once more, if clipping masks are available to you, you would apply it as a clipping mask. And here you can use the blending mode Linear Burn or Multiply. Both are great for shadows and lower the opacity, for now around 50%, but we're going to come back to it later. Now for your shadows, the only thing I would recommend is to try avoiding neutral colors, so neutral grays or black, because they make your shadows look really, really muddy. So just adding a bit of a tint, like a little bit of a lilac, like what I'm doing. And then you can just softly, with a soft brush, paint your shadows. So not the scale shadows, but really the global shadows. Like I was saying earlier, I'm pretending that my light source is on the top left, so my shadows are going to be focused on the bottom right. And feel free to adjust, like I was saying, the opacity. So once you've painted it, it's much easier to say, what opacity you need to use. So just find something that you like. And we're going to do the same thing, but with lights this time. So just creating a new layer, applying it as a clipping mask if it's available to you, renaming it to Global Lights. And for this one, I'm gonna go with Add, but not gonna lie, I don't like the look of it. So if you use Add, lower the opacity a lot, otherwise it's going to look kind of bad. And you can use a super bright yellow if you want to mimic the sun. Any bright color is going to work, and you can just paint some kind of random lights, honestly, on the part of your sphere that is in the light, or the part of your piece that's in the light. Now, you can see it doesn't look quite right, and even if you play with opacity, not the best. Same thing as what happened with the feathers. At this point, maybe you would want to use this global lights as a layer below the scale shadows so that it doesn't look quite as washed out. But that's really a question of personal preference, so you can experiment with that. One other thing you might want to do to bring even more life to your scale is to add a highlight layer above everything. This one is also going to be a Copic mask, and you're also going to use the blending mode add. And in terms of brushes here, you have a few options. You could go back to a precise gritty brush, like a pencil brush like the 6B pencil in the sketching panel if you're working with Procreate, or you could stick with the same hard brush or soft brush as before, just making it very thin. And in terms of highlights, you also have a bunch of different options on how you can paint them. I'm just going along the edge of the, sorry for my head right there. I'm just going along the edge of the side of the scale that is facing the light source. So once you've painted once, you can go back and play with the opacity of your layer. I don't want mine to be too intense, but if you're painting scales that, for example, are underwater or are wet, you would have them really shiny. And you can add as many little highlights as you want. So you could have just one line that is following the very edge of the scale, and then maybe a second line right outside of it to just add even more shine to your piece. So really, here you can experiment. It's not super complicated, but it really brings a lot more texture and volume to your scales. If you have scales that have like the little tent that I was talking about, you might want to add a highlight on the top of that little ridge, I guess. So here really it's a question of experimenting, but also keeping in mind what I said earlier about not wanting to have too much details on your scale. So if you're just practicing on a sphere, that's fine. But if you're painting scales, for example, on a fish, don't bother painting highlights on all the scales. Just focus on the parts that are in focus. And again, we're going to talk about that later in the tips section, but the thing about scales is, you know, I want to give you the technique and I want to give you the tools so that you know the different kind of steps you can take to make your scales look good. But I also want to make sure that I don't overwhelmingly paint the scales, because you could go in and paint really realistic scales and that would probably look better than those right now on the sphere. But if you were to translate those realistic scales to a full-on fish or a full-on lizard or like a crocodile or something like that, it would look insane. So yeah, just using your judgment here. So I'm going with a bit more of a stylized feel for that reason. But if you want to have more realistic scales, it's just going to be a question of adding a bunch of details, looking at a lot of reference, and I mean that's not the goal here. So we're going to go with an in-between. And at this stage, once we have all the main layers created and sketched and drawn and blended, you definitely want to go back and play with the different blending modes and different opacity. So that's what I was saying earlier, you know, when we start painting the shadows first, that's all there is. So you're going to probably be tempted to put them quite light, but when we start layering stuff on top, you're probably going to want to make them a bit more opaque. So just go back, experiment with that, play with your blending modes. You can even play with the order of the layer depending on the type of I keep wanting to say feather, the type of scales you're painting, until you get something that you like. But once more, don't worry about having the scales be super defined, because again, it can be very overwhelming. I know I'm repeating myself, but I can't stress that enough. And if you are painting scales that are really in focus and that's the most important part of your illustration, you could go ahead and create a new layer and draw some patterns on the scales. And the color of those and just the placement in general, how you treat them, is really going to depend on, again, the type of scales or the type of animal. I personally like to make it look mystical, so just draw a bunch of light dots on top of everything. So just creating a new layer, renaming it to details. Here I want them to be light, so I'm using the blending mode add in a bright color and just drawing a bunch of tiny dots. But again, that's only if you're painting scales that are really in focus and are the main part of your piece. Otherwise, seriously, don't spend time on that. It's actually maybe going to make your piece look a bit worse if they're just, you know, something that is in the background or not a focal point of your illustration. And there's one more thing I want to show you before we go to the general scales painting tips. If you have scales, which is not the case in my illustration here, but if you have scales with the vertical line, like the tint effect, you might want to go back on your global light layer and erase the side of the scale that is not, well, the side of the scale that is in the dark. I'm not sure how to explain that with words. Again, I'm struggling today, guys. I'm sorry about that. But you want to make sure basically that your global lights are coherent with the lights on the scales themselves. So you could really create a quick pattern that way. And yeah, just keeping that in mind, basically. So now that we've looked at the main key elements of how to draw scales, let's talk about the things you need to keep in mind when painting them in context, whether it's with a reference picture or not. So if you're watching this video as part of the full course, now is the time where you can pause and come back tomorrow for day 2 of the scale study, where you're going to practice the same texture with the same technique, but this time using a reference picture instead of just the sphere. Otherwise, make sure you keep watching because these tips can really make a big difference in the final result of your artwork. When you're painting scales, there are a few specific questions you need to ask yourself to make sure they look right for your piece. So on top of thinking about the regular coloring and shading considerations, thinking about stuff like the type of animal is absolutely essential because it's going to affect so many things. Is it a reptile, a fish, a mammal? You know, different species have very different scales. Some are pointy, some are round, some are thick, some are shiny, some are so thin that they're almost see-through. You can also ask yourself, is the animal wet, which would make the scales glisten even more? So you can see that the key here is to keep those questions in mind when you're creating your own piece and to make sure to look at reference picture of the specific animal that you are working on, so you make sure that these scales are the right ones. Another tip here is to, just like for the feathers, focus on only the key parts of the animals instead of drawing precise scales everywhere, because that would take just forever, but it also make your animal look way too busy. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn how to paint more textures and materials, I highly recommend you check out this playlist. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.